What is this? Where is Pink?
She's gone.
What did you say?
She's gone!
As Rebecca Sugar has confirmed, White Diamond considers herself a part of everyone. She lacks self-identification outside of her role and sees herself as a symbolic figurehead of perfect rational objectivity which everyone must strive towards. In this video, I will try to unravel exactly what that means. First though, we have to get Freudian, because Rebecca Sugar in the creation of the diamonds relies heavily on the concept of your conscience versus your desires, but not in the good versus evil way. In this instance, conscience represents homeworld's hierarchy. The diamonds can be understood as a body divided into the personification of the id, the ego, and the superego. White Diamond is the superego. While this is given an obvious visual dimension through the existence of the diamond ship, it's worth looking at the meaning of these words before we proceed. As mentioned, the division of the id, the ego, and the superego is originally a Freudian concept. However, you don't need to agree with Freud in order to apply their personification in fiction. On a basic level, these concepts concern themselves with the conflict between our moral compass, the superego, and our immediate drives and feelings, the id. Placed between these is the ego, which is the true self in the sense that it must contend with both what their emotions want and what their conscience is telling them. It's comparable to how you don't need to believe that the Kubler-Ross model is applicable to every real person in order to examine the concept of the 5 stages of grief in fiction. And even though Freud termed these concepts, he was far from the first person to describe them. Plato conceptualized the mind as 2 horses and a chariot, in which the chariot rider represents reason and the horses roughly represent noble, good-willed passion versus, well, as you can imagine, the many destructive drives and selfish temptations of humanity. Cultures all over the world have similar stories in which the protagonist is pulled between their immediate desires and whatever the narrator in question considers morally good. So there are a lot of ways in which you can basically slice the same pie. Your mileage may vary on which terms you prefer. However, for this video, we are going to be sticking to the identification of the id, the ego, and the superego, because that's how Rebecca Sugar has described the diamonds, and that's the inspiration for their corresponding place in the diamond ship and respective gem placements. So, let's start from the bottom.
But in order to fix it, we'd have to admit that it's broken.
She'll never want to hear it.
As for this latest little game of yours, thank the stars it's over.
Could you imagine that running a colony would be this dull?
Pink, quit fooling around! She has to set an example.
As the id, Pink Diamond is defined by her emotions. She is the youngest of the diamonds and the most likely to do things merely because she wants to do them. At the beginning of the story, she has no moral compass whatsoever. What matters to her is having fun, entertaining herself, and satisfying her own needs. In this context, her belly button gem represents instinct, doing something just because you have a gut feeling. The belly button, of course, is also the direct line between the person who gives birth and the resulting child. She engages with the world through expression of her immediate emotions. When she doesn't get what she wants, she, as Stephen observed, throws a tantrum and expects to be treated as a responsible and competent diamond, despite lacking the moral compass that would allow her to put the needs of others before herself.
What? No. If I went down to the kindergarten, I would never hear the end of it from
Yellow and blue are 2 sides of the ego. They're both emotionally driven at their core, hence they are heart gems, but they're aware of the needs of society as well. The response to the balance between the needs of the self and the moral needs of the empire are drastically different, where blue places more outward emphasis on emotions and yellow more outward emphasis on duty, but they both become creatures of balance through their interaction with each other and the occasional subversion of these patterns. In fact, part of why Blue was more immediately sympathetic to a lot of people is actually this imbalance. She's emotional, and so she comes across as more immediately available and relatable. But between the two of them, she's also more selfish, whereas Pink initially doesn't really have the cognitive awareness of the needs of the Empire. Blue does, but chooses to act on her own emotions anyway. Yellow even calls her out on this, saying that Blue is so absorbed in her grief that she can't be relied on as a diamond. She metaphorically and literally drags people down to her level of self-centered emotion, because that's who she is. So yes, she's emotionally available, but within the context of coping with grief, still concerned primarily with her own needs. This is occasionally subverted, such as being more implicitly open-minded to contrarian evidence during the trial, and emotions are implicitly more allowed in her court, so she's not hypocritical in this prioritization, but that's part of what makes her the ego, how she attempts to balance her emotional and moral rational awareness. Yellow is undeniably emotional as well, but she balances the ego through the immersion of herself into her role as leader of the Empire. This is the moral conscience she brings into her conversations with Blue. She's implied to work basically 24/7 for the perpetuation of the system. She may therefore come across as colder and seem more emotionally insensitive to the needs of the individual. But that does not mean she doesn't have these emotional needs. She does, and sometimes she will lash out. But it's filtered through the awareness of a higher duty. Even if she can be outwardly emotional, her primary drive is still that of doing her job, not because she wants to, but because she feels she must. She thinks that's the right thing to do.
Of course we still love her, and we're always thinking of her. Don't you know I miss her too? But tell me, what's the use of feeling? What's the use of feeling? What's the use of feeling? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Blue also has an innate sense that she must, which she initially prioritizes lower, but you can see a bit of an evolution where she focuses more on her work for its own sake after being quote-unquote reunited with Pink.
Can't really help it.
You aren't thinking of inviting your Earth friends, are you?
Why wouldn't I? They can't come? Aren't they my court or whatever?
Pink, quit fooling around. White Diamond is going to be there. We have to present her with our best possible selves, just as our gems have to present us with their best possible selves. A ball is a chance to inspire everyone.
All of which brings us to White Diamond. Not merely a character who sees herself as principally responsible for those around her, but someone whose moral conscience completely dominates her mind, and who rejects subjective emotions and relationships out of hand. As Rebecca Sugar put it, White doesn't truly have an identity. She doesn't conceive of herself as an individual separate from the larger body of gemkind. To her, everything is collective. Indeed, as the superego, her existence revolves around the perpetuation of the system, not for her own sake, but for the sake of gemkind. Rejecting emotion and individuality for the sake of the continued function of society. She considers herself a selfless logic kind of person, in the coldest sense of the word. I think this has led some people to misunderstanding her character, because when you latch onto this abusive mother trope, you may not be able to connect it to other facets of her character in good faith. And so many people end up being unable to truly judge White for who she is and what she believes. Thusly, some are confused by her change of heart. We'll get to that. And for some of you paying attention, I'm sure it must be a bit off-putting to hear me describe White as selfless, considering that she's essentially referred to herself as perfect. But these aren't antonyms. One does not need to be humble to think one is doing the right thing. Quite the contrary. I think it's more accurate to describe her in the following terms. The perpetuation of a morally perfect self for the sake of the selfless fulfillment of duty and guidance of others towards that collective goal. Emphasis on that last part, the guidance of others. So, what do I mean by that? Well, yeah, she believes in her own perfection, but to a purpose. She believes that her perfection exists to inspire a kind of selflessness in others. In her view, gemkind exists to perpetuate itself. And so what the individual wants is less important than continually producing more gems to fit into the system. This is supported by Yellow and Blue. In fact, you understand a lot of what drives White just by listening to them. This is also supported by how White relates to others. Listen to how she frames her discussion with Steven, who, you'll recall, she fully sees as Pink Diamond at this point in the show.
What are you doing crawling in here? You want your legs back? You want your planet back? Surely you can understand why I can't let you leave. Look what you did to yourself last time.
They're fine the way they are, flaws and all.
There you go again. Do you understand why you defend their flaws? I know why, Pink. You like surrounding yourself with inferior gems.
What?
You enable their terrible behavior so you can be the best of the worst.
That's not true. And even if it is, even if it was, you're talking about my mom. You're not talking about me. Let her go.
These worthless gems weren't enough, were they? See how you surround yourself with lower life forms? You've smothered yourself in them. It feels good, doesn't it, Pink? Dulling your power, hiding your face, blaming everything on someone else.
She scolds Pink, or who she thinks is Pink, for abandoning the moral responsibility of a diamond by surrounding herself with lesser gems, quote-unquote, who don't serve a purpose in her mind, in which case their individual existence is inherently selfish because it's putting what one wants above the needs of the collective. This mindset allowed White to project responsibility outwards. That's how she would define a selfish person, someone who considers her own needs and the needs of those she has immediate subjective relationships with over what she perceives as the common good. White also enforces this idea of an objective good, quote-unquote, for the collective through the use of pronouns. Her will is everyone's will. She uses a collective we to assert herself as the default. Additionally, she tries to reinstate the pre-war status quo in which, because she's thrilled and relieved, everyone is. They should therefore focus less on mourning Pink and more on their duties towards the Empire. This is part of what I mean when I say she doesn't truly have an identity, because she is, in her own mind, the objective standard of what is good, who does not feel something as imperfect as subjective experience. Everyone else are extensions of herself, if a less perfect part, who thusly play less important roles in the system. There's seemingly a spiritual dimension to this mentality. Symbolically, all gems are light. White is the most literal personification of that light. Therefore, it's not a stretch for her, as somebody who always thinks of the collective, to envision gemkind as kind of the same body. She is on top because she is the head, the one who created and embodies the light, whose light is purest and shines to bring forth that same light in others. That is her duty in her own understanding of it. Everyone else's duty is to continually perpetuate this same light, their own best, most selfless selves. This is also part of why a core tenet of homeworld mentality is robotics and replaceability. It influences the designs of gems and their ability to read code, their mechanical limb enhancers, how their forms can glitch out, and their belief in a hierarchy in which the rarest part of the computer system, that is homeworld, are the most valuable. This is not because the personhood of a rare gem necessarily matters for its own sake, but because their role in society at large does. Sapphire isn't considered less replaceable than Ruby because of her appearance or her gem shape, but because of what she can contribute to gem society. Hence, a Sapphire who doesn't have this ability are shunned. This is in and of itself connected to the idea of White's version of selflessness. And I believe this is part of why Homeworld is simultaneously flippant and horrified by death. It's the mentality of believing resources used on those who do not or cannot contribute meaningfully to society are resources wasted. This resource logic perpetuates itself through the system in this way where a diamond's death is obviously tragic, not because of her personhood, but because of her role and what she means to the gems below her. This is a waste because it is not readily replaceable. On the other hand, the death of a ruby can be justified because her role is easily replaceable. Whatever is best for the continued function of society, that's the resource logic. The second part of this equation is that if you essentially consider yourself a singular being, be it the mechanical clockwork of fate as Jasper envisions, or a spiritually tied body of one self as White thinks, where she remains the head, the superego, then the death of lesser parts through shattering or harvesting is not truly death. Their will lives on through her because she is the default arbiter of what is best for the collective, and sees herself as completely objective and neutral in this task. Thusly, she denies not only her own individuality, but the individual wills of others. Homeworld's moral logic in my mind is less centered on death than it is on a cycle of rebirth and evolution. The system may feel justified considering that A, no gem would exist if not for the diamonds, whose essence seem necessary for the reproduction of gemkind, and B, if a gem is shattered, they're not technically dead. Their consciousness has merely been fractured into pieces. To summarize this point, they don't exist as themselves anymore, but they do, in some form, exist. So, if everyone's will is collective, and that will is expressed through the hierarchy, then, by White's logic, killing a ruby, for instance, is no more dramatic than a dying cell in a body being replaced by the exact same type of cell. But if you lost your hand, or your leg, or your mind, that would be a bigger deal, because their function is less readily replaceable. It's no accident that a lot of Homeworld and White Diamond's influence is from the movie Metropolis, which deals heavily with the dehumanization of the individual in an industrialized society, in which the workers are merely replaceable cogs in a machine. That is the brand of quote-unquote selflessness that Homeworld can be considered our response to. Though I think what's most fascinating about this is that the diamonds, particularly White, aren't hypocritical in the way we've been trained to expect. That is, they're not your typical lazy monarch who hoards their status for their own sake, and therefore are both easy to hate and easy to distance ourselves from. Instead, they are principally genuinely ideological in the sense that they are of the belief that they, too, are only as valuable as what they contribute to society.
I know my purpose isn't to be happy, but I find it harder and harder to enforce your rules when they make me miserable, when they make us all miserable.
And indeed, that worldview is what would come to cause White's breakdown. It's no accident that Steven Universe, right down to its concept art, has always been fascinated with the mother-daughter relationship, and how one's ideals are shaped by one's society. How a creator molds her creations and projects herself outward, and how her creations, in turn, are molded by their circumstances. This is evident in pretty much every Homeworld gem. I think this walks a tactful balance of acknowledging the horror of the system from this quote-unquote subjective, individual-focused perspective of the crystal gems, while also understanding that a lot of the gems in this system believe they're acting in everyone's best interest. Peridot thinks this, Jasper thinks this, Nephrite thinks this, Ruby used to think this under Homeworld, Yellow and Blue Diamond really think this. And that brings us to the source of this cycle of creation herself, to the impeccable judgment, quote-unquote, of White Diamond, and the show's thesis on how one breaks out of this toxic ideal of perfection. It's actually a lot simpler than it sounds, but it's not easy.
Are you back together? Are you?
Yeah, I'm me. I've always been me.
No! You are Pink Diamond! You're just acting like a child!
I am a child. What's your excuse?
I've spent a great deal of time in this video talking about White's mindset as these ideas of being default, of being objective or impartial, if you will, of seeing everyone as akin to yourself and putting societal needs before individual needs. But what's really at the core of this is denial, because you can only see yourself as perfectly objective through the denial of your own emotions, desires, and biases, and thusly denying the importance of listening to other people's perspectives. And to perpetuate your own perfection and set that as a goal to all of society to strive towards, you need to believe that you never want anything just for your own sake, and that you are always selflessly, coldly logical, and that your perceptions always encapsulate the full story. In other words, if you are perfect, you can never be selfish and never be wrong. You can't have a flaw, not even one.
We used to be
This is by necessity why White is written both as the most defiantly avoidant Diamond and as the quickest to break.
I can't have a flaw. I'm supposed to be flawless.
Like most well-written characters, White strives towards self-justification. She's supposed to be the one calling everyone else out for being selfish and emotional. She's always right. That's what she tries to do to Pink.
You've smothered yourself in them. It feels good, doesn't it, Pink?
While she herself remains, as she sees it, ever responsible, ever neutral, and ever selflessly devoted to the collective. Ad nauseum. It never ends. Ad nauseum. It never ends. Her perception of herself and others is unyielding. As a mother or parental figure of sorts, those are the values she wishes to inspire in Pink. When she says, "I only want you to be yourself," that is what she thinks she means. But it has a dual meaning. We'll get to that. For now, it is enough to say that through this scene, something strange happens. White has already decided that she knows Pink is Pink, and knowing Pink's flaws inside and out, she's merely hiding behind another disguise to fool her friends and fool herself and avoid responsibility. Moreover, she insists she doesn't need Pink, which is in line with her worldview. After all, subjective relationships based on emotion rather than duty is a flaw of her creations, and not of herself. But is this in line with reality? We know that before Pink disappeared, the Diamonds used to be together. When Pink left, that stopped. White became more distant. So a crack becomes increasingly evident in the balance of her light, and that crack is Pink herself. After all, why is White wrong? What is it that she's missing that's causing her to deny Pink is truly gone? I believe the answer to that lies in White's own desires, the part she always has to suppress. She doesn't want Pink to be gone, and so she tries to perpetuate the reality where she never has to face that fact. You see, what lets White live in a world of perfection is that she denies any part of herself which does not fit what she believes she should be. But that's also the source of her fragility, because a perfect robot cannot be confronted with the reality of its own subjectivity. And so, the only defense mechanism she has left after Pink was gone was to isolate herself, in a way she never has to talk to anyone she cares about, because then she might let it slip that she, too, has feelings which contradict her ideals. That is what allowed White to be the last holdout. Her self-isolation was something that, especially in the immediate aftermath of Pink's death, probably felt essential to hold on to the denial of not feeling anything at all. Being open with others would be too much to bear. She would break. She couldn't be perfect. The role of a diamond is described with various terms throughout the show. From their own perspective, they are leaders, they are creators, they are responsible for those beneath them. They must lead others because they're the only ones quote-unquote able to do so, and as symbolic leaders, they represent what the gems they create should strive to be like. They believe gems beneath them are extensions of themselves, and thusly project themselves and their own will onto their kind. They believe all of this is necessary in order to perpetuate their empire, in which the attainment of resources is always justified through the creation of new life to perpetuate the status quo. They see humans and other organic beings as beneath them, as lesser, as they are creatures not created by the diamonds. The same way a parental figure may express concern for their own children, but simultaneously be willing to ignore or actively sabotage the lives of other children to give their own an advantage. The gems were also earlier conceptualized as more goddess-like figures, in which they might look down on others because they're basically immortal, and to them, draining humanity's planet is no different than taking the food of a dayfly who was going to die in 6 hours anyway. It is cruel. It is the prejudiced attitude which disregard how something being temporary doesn't mean it doesn't experience feelings, and that just because humans don't fit into their system doesn't mean their system is justified. Rose initially broke from this because she is the id. She liked humans, much like the rainbow worms she took from the Kyanite colony. She saw them as fun creatures who would be sad to lose. She cares about them, but in a paternalistic way. This is an attitude she would keep until Greg proved that, unlike the gems around her, he was willing to genuinely challenge her and react to her paternalistic attitude towards humanity. In other words, Rose's quest didn't start out as perfectly altruistically as she frames herself, even if she obviously thought it was sad that humans would die out. This is also why White sees her as childish. She reads that Rose often acts on her emotions and doesn't fully understand the creature she wants to keep. She reads this as a flaw, similar to how she considers herself a more logical, less emotional version of the other diamonds. Therefore, she emphasizes that she doesn't need these personal connections, relationships, or feelings. Being perfect, she only thinks of what she perceives as the objective greater good. She symbolically gave her colors a stand-in for emotion, a personal perspective, and identity in the creation of the other diamonds, which serves as a microcosm of the entire empire. She must be her best self, not only for the non-diamond gems, but be the ideal diamond which the other diamonds strive towards. Enter Steven. The only way White can identify him as one of her children is to keep believing that he is pink. White, as the creator of Gemkind, believes that not only does she know best for all gems, she knows their flaws, because she projected those supposed flaws onto them in their creation. But the thing is, however objectively she tries to frame herself, White is just as subjective and emotional as everyone else. She wants pink back because that would mean the restoration of the status quo, in which the four diamonds are together, they rule eternally, and she herself is ultimately justified in her role because she was always right all along. She is falling into this very human trap that one can ever be completely objective and emotionless.
But I'm not supposed to be like this. I'm supposed to know better. I'm supposed to be better. I'm supposed to make everything better.
But that's what she's built her self-justification on, knowing all the facts and ignoring all the feelings, so she never has to listen to what anyone else thinks. But when she's ultimately proven wrong about pink still being there, and she has a reaction to that, it only takes one such incident for her to realize that she's not perfect, and so she cannot justify that she supposedly knows best for everyone else. It's not that Steven was the first person to challenge her the way Greg did with Rose, it was that this was the first time White believed it. She could no longer distance herself from her emotions that she projected onto everyone else because Steven, through not being pink, proved that White could keep holding on to an incorrect worldview if it was what her emotions were telling her to do, even when it flew in the face of the increasingly obvious facts. How fitting then that it is a sensitive human who has always been aware of his own emotions and found healthy ways to process and express them, who ultimately takes her down. This is the inherent fragility of the superego. White could not survive being wrong because her entire existence, role, and identity revolved around that never happening.
If I'm not perfect, then who am I? If you're not pink, then who are you? Who is anyone?
You know, just let everyone be whoever they are. let yourself be whoever you are too.
White Diamond thus teaches us that the denial of emotions or flaws does not mean that they don't exist within you. She avoids the other diamonds, refuses to hold conversations where she may reveal any vulnerability, and uses White Pearl as a way to indicate that she's present and judging everyone else without herself ever being emotionally available. But nobody's completely unemotional. Even if you consider yourself perfectly logical and never believe any outright lies, everyone picks which fact they consider most important based on their worldview. The need to justify oneself and confirm what you already feel exists within everyone, even within people who portray themselves as ruled only by logic, facts, and a supposed lack of feelings. If you don't realize this, if you don't examine your tendency to deny your own feelings and limitations, you may end up never questioning yourself and denying how you protect the status quo, which is the easiest way to be ruled by it. White isn't literally off color, but showing blush or imbalanced light was symbolic of displaying emotions that she tried to rid herself of by projecting them onto her creations, the other diamonds. White can be embarrassed, angered, and fearful. Steven merely called attention to those feelings, but it was White herself who needed to realize that she was wrong about Steven being pink and herself being perfectly unemotional. White is the ultimate embodiment of a diamond because she is simultaneously the strongest and the most brittle. She can ignore whatever criticism or argument comes outwards in the form of blue, yellow, pink, or Steven, but she cannot ignore it when she, internally, is the one who is confronted with her emotions and realizes she was wrong. And thus, the tower of logic that she's built around her crumbles, as it was utterly lacking in self-awareness about her own emotions. She is embarrassed by her flaws, which she perceives as her attachment towards Pink and ignorance of Steven's true identity. She can no longer assume she knows best, and so she can no longer rationalize being the ultimate judge of a gem's place in the world.
Isn't this such a beautiful night? Whoa, we're underneath 1,000 shining stars. Isn't it nice to find yourself somewhere different? Whoa, why don't you let yourself just be wherever you are? Why don't you let yourself just be somewhere different? Whoa, why don't you let yourself just be whoever you are?